You have probably been told that Kursk is where Hitler threw away Germany's tanks against a wall of Soviet defenses and ground the panzer divisions into the dirt. The German records say something else. Germany went into Kursk with around 2,500 tanks. It came out with most of them. Across the whole of Operation Citadel, the Germans lost around 323 tanks destroyed, roughly 1 in 10 of the force they committed. The Soviets lost more than 1,600. Germany sent in between 146 and 211 Tiger tanks and permanently lost fewer than 20 of them. If warfare were scored by tank kill ratios, the Germans won the armoured battle at Kursk by a staggering margin. They lost the campaign anyway, and within 6 weeks the Red Army was driving west on a front that never stopped moving until it reached Berlin. Destroying tanks and winning battles, it turned out, were never the same thing. So how does an army win the biggest tank battle of the war and lose everything that battle was supposed to decide? The tanks were not the wound. The answer starts with a decision that looked reasonable from inside Hitler's headquarters and turned out to be fatal for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the thing history blames. By the spring of 1943, the winter had ended badly for Germany. An entire army had surrendered at Stalingrad. Then, in February and March, Erich von Manstein had pulled off one of the most impressive operational recoveries of the war, retaking the city of Kharkov and stabilizing a front that had looked close to collapse. When the spring mud froze the fighting in place, the line had a large bulge in it around the city of Kursk, pushing west into German-held territory. That bulge was the obvious target. It was the most exposed point in the entire Soviet line, vulnerable to attack from the north and the south at once. Pinch it off, trap the Soviet armies inside it, and Germany could shorten its front, free up divisions, and inflict the kind of catastrophic loss that might force the Red Army back onto its heels for another season. The German command was not united on this. Manstein wanted to strike early, while the Soviets were still off balance from the winter fighting. Heinz Guderian, the man rebuilding Germany's tank forces, wanted no part of it, and said so. He thought the panzer divisions should be saved for 1944, not spent on a frontal assault into a position the enemy could see coming. Walter Model, the general who would have to lead the northern attack, looked at aerial photographs of the Soviet defenses going up across the salient and told Hitler he did not have enough men or tanks to break through them. 3 of Germany's best generals reached 3 different conclusions, and Hitler chose a 4th. He would attack, but not yet. He would wait for the new tanks. The logic behind it was real enough. In the summer of 1943, the German army was at the peak of its technical advantage over the Soviets for the entire war. The Red Army was still building almost its whole tank force around a single 76mm gun. Against that, Germany was fielding the Tiger with armor that Soviet guns struggled to penetrate at any range, and the new Panther designed to outshoot anything the Soviets could put in front of it. A German tank crew in a Tiger could engage and kill Soviet armor from distances at which the Soviets could not effectively shoot back. Hitler looked at that gap and made a bet a lot of commanders would have made. Wait for enough of these machines to reach the front, and the quality of the German tank could overwhelm the quantity of the Soviet one. On paper, the math worked. In practice, half the bet broke down before it fired a shot. Of the roughly 184 Panthers rushed to the front for Kursk, mechanical failure knocked out around 100 in the first few days. The transmissions shattered under the tank's weight, the fuel pumps leaked and set engines on fire, and by the 6th day of the offensive, only about 10 Panthers were still running. The wonder weapon Hitler had waited months for spent the battle being towed to repair shops. The Tiger, though, performed exactly as promised. So the bet was not entirely wrong, and that is the trap. The half of it that worked was real enough to justify the delay. And that delay was the most expensive decision Hitler made all year. The problem with waiting for a better weapon is that the enemy does not wait with you. Every week, Hitler delayed Citadel to accumulate more Tigers and Panthers was a week the Soviets spent turning the Kursk Salient into the most heavily fortified piece of ground in the history of warfare. And they knew exactly where to build, because they knew the attack was coming. This is the detail that turns the whole campaign tragic rather than simply stupid. Soviet intelligence had given Stalin the German plan in advance. When Marshal Georgy Zhukov inspected the Kursk positions and reported back in April, he correctly predicted not just that the Germans would attack the salient, but that German infantry losses from the winter meant the assault would have to lean heavily on tanks and aircraft. The Red Army was preparing for a specific attack it had already seen the shape of, down to the timing and the axis. So while the panzer divisions waited in their assembly areas for the tank transporters to arrive, 300,000 Soviet civilians dug. They built 8 successive belts of defenses running back nearly 200 miles in depth. They laid more than 400,000 mines. They dug trenches that, laid end to end, would have stretched further than the distance from Moscow to Madrid. Behind it all, they massed the largest concentration of artillery the Eastern Front had yet seen, and they held their best tank armies back in reserve, refusing to feed them into the first line. The Soviets had also learned how to absorb a German attack. They put their least experienced units in the forward belts to take the first shock, and held their veteran formations back to counterattack once the German advance had worn itself down against the depth. The cost would fall hardest on the men in the front line, and that was by design. By the time Hitler finally launched Citadel on the 5th of July, the technical edge he had held out for was real. The wall in front of it was now nearly impossible to climb. He had spent 2 months sharpening his sword and handing the enemy the time to dig a moat. Guderian saw it coming. In a conversation that summer, he asked Hitler directly why Germany needed to attack at all in the East that year. Hitler's answer, by Guderian's account, was that whenever he thought about the attack, his stomach turned over. He launched it anyway. When the attack came, it went almost exactly the way the German tank crews would have hoped, and almost exactly the way the German strategy could not afford. In the north, Model's attack stalled fast. His tactics relied on infantry to break the line before the armor went through, and his infantry was not strong enough to do it against defenses that deep. He ground forward 9 miles in 6 days and never reached his first day's objective. In the south, Hoth's 4th Panzer Army did better, and at a place called Prokhorovka, they ran into the Soviet reserve that had been held back for exactly this moment, the 5th Guards Tank Army. The collision at Prokhorovka on the 12th of July became the most famous tank battle in history and one of the most thoroughly misremembered. The legend says the Soviets stopped the SS Panzers in a glorious head-on charge that destroyed hundreds of German tanks and saved Kursk. The German records say something close to the opposite. The 3 SS divisions in the fight, Leibstandarte, Das Reich and Totenkopf, had dozens of tanks damaged that day, but their total write-offs, the tanks gone for good, numbered fewer than 10. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, hurling itself at close range against the longer-ranged German guns, lost several hundred. Tactically and numerically, the Germans won at Prokhorovka. Pavel Rotmistrov, the Soviet commander whose tank army was wrecked at Prokhorovka, filed an after-action report that wildly inflated the German losses. That report, not the German records, became the Soviet account, and the Soviet account is what the West repeated for half a century. The real German numbers stayed buried in quartermaster files until historians like David Glantz and Karl-Heinz Frieser pulled them out of the archives in the 1990s. The low German figures also have a mechanical explanation. A tank counted as a total write-off only if it was obliterated or left on ground the enemy captured. The Germans were experts at hauling damaged tanks back to the workshops overnight and returning them to the line within days. So a knocked-out panzer on ground they still held often came back. A Soviet tank in the same state, on that same ground, was gone for good. Holding the field was worth more than winning any single duel, and at Prokhorovka the Germans held it. The historian David Glantz, who spent decades inside the Soviet archives, put his finger on what almost every documentary misses. German armoured losses at Kursk were not catastrophic. The losses among the infantry were. Some of it fell on the panzer grenadiers who fought alongside the tanks, but the heaviest bleeding fell on the ordinary infantry divisions, the foot soldiers who had to clear the trenches and break the gun lines before the armour could move at all. German casualties for Citadel came to around 54,000 men, and the overwhelming majority were not tank crews. They were the men on foot in the defensive belts. The Soviets had built those belts around concealed batteries of anti-tank guns, sighted to hold fire until German armour rolled into a prepared kill zone and then open up in crossfire from several directions at once. Clearing them was infantry work, done on foot, under fire, and it was lethal. The men went into the belts in front of Olkhovatka and Prokhorovka, and they did not come out in anything like the numbers that went in. A tank arm without infantry to support it cannot exploit a breakthrough, even when it achieves one. Germany punched holes in the Soviet line at Kursk. It did not have the foot soldiers left to pour through them and turn a local success into the encirclement the whole plan depended on. The panzers were winning their private battle while the army around them was being hollowed out, and a tank that wins every duel still loses the war if the men who hold the ground behind it are gone. And yet, in the south, one German general looked at that same battlefield and saw a victory still within reach. He would spend the rest of his life insisting he had been right. Quick aside before we get to him. If this is the kind of history you have been looking for, subscribing is what keeps the channel making it. Now, back to the general who thought Kursk could still be won, and the order that stopped him. On the 13th of July, the day after Prokhorovka, Hitler summoned Manstein to his headquarters in East Prussia and told him Citadel was over. Three things had landed at once. The Western Allies had invaded Sicily on the 10th, threatening the Italian peninsula. In the north, the Soviets had launched Operation Kutuzov, driving straight into the rear of Model's 9th Army. And Hitler had already decided he needed those same panzer divisions to defend Italy. That last blow mattered most. The northern pincer was not stalled anymore. It was fighting for its life, and the reserves Manstein wanted for the south were the only thing that could stop the north from collapsing. Hitler decided to shut the offensive down and start pulling divisions out. Manstein was furious, and his objection is the heart of an argument historians are still having. He believed his southern attack was on the edge of a real success. His Panzer Corps was still intact. The Soviet tank reserve in front of him had just been gutted at Prokhorovka, and he had fresh formations he had not yet committed. Give him a few more days, he argued, and he could destroy what was left of the Soviet armor in the south before the offensive was called off. Hitler let him continue for a short while, then overruled him completely and took his panzer divisions away. Manstein spent the rest of his life arguing he had been robbed of victory, and his memoir made that case so well it shaped how the West understood the battle for decades. But the case has an enormous hole. Behind the battered 5th Guards tank army stood the entire Soviet steppe front under Ivan Konev. Hundreds of thousands of fresh men and intact armoured corps that had not yet fired a shot, waiting for exactly the breakthrough Manstein thought he was about to achieve. His exhausted divisions, at the end of long supply lines, would have driven straight into a force several times larger than the one they had just beaten. So who was right? Both answers hold up. One says Hitler made the correct call. The northern attack had already collapsed under Kutuzov. The goal of encircling the Soviet armies was gone, and pushing deeper would only have fed Manstein's last reserves into Konev's waiting front. The southern pincer was the one place Germany still had momentum. The SS Panzer Corps came through Prokhorovka in genuinely good shape, and the size of those Soviet reserves rests partly on the same Soviet records that inflated everything else about the battle. Both readings use the same facts. What separates them is whether you trust Manstein's confidence or the paper's strength of the force waiting behind the hill. And that is a sharper question than the cartoon, where a stubborn dictator throws his tanks at a wall and watches them burn. The popular story of Kursk survives because it is simple. A clear villain, a clear weapon, a clear lesson. It is also, in almost every particular, wrong, and what it gets wrong is bigger than one battle. Germany had built an army that could win nearly any fight put in front of it, and could not afford the cost of winning. The thing it ran short of at Kursk was never the brilliant machine. It was the ordinary soldier standing next to the machine and the time and the men that no factory could turn out on a production line. Hitler did not lose Kursk by being a fool about tanks. He lost it by winning the tank battle and finding out, too late, that the tank battle was never the one that mattered. So here is the question. When Hitler halted the attack, was he cutting his losses or throwing away the one part of Kursk that was still winning? Tell me which and why. If you want more history that takes apart the story everyone agrees on and looks at what the records actually say, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.